This conference will
Generally, what you
now be
find is
recorded.
providing dedicated level 2, which is typically how most charging has been done in the past, is expensive to be able to do for every park install, averaging about $3,000 per stall. But there's the ways to design for so-called EV energy management systems that significantly reduce those upfront costs. So in this archetype, looking at costs more on the order of $750 per stall. For the mid-rise archetypes we looked at, there were costs more on the order of $550. So EV energy management, it refers to a range of different technologies. In a nutshell, you've got charging stations that have a degree of intelligence and are able to communicate across a network, so a cellular network or wireless or cable in the walls, and they can understand whether other vehicles are charging at the same time across a given circuit and throttle down their consumption so that they don't exceed the capacity of the circuit or the capacity of the building as a whole for some EV energy management technologies. What that does is reduce the electrical demand and the size of electrical infrastructure that needs to be put in place into buildings. And that's what reduces the cost of construction, as well as will control peak demand and utility demand charges that customers will face. So in previous versions of the Canada Electric Code, there were some forms of EV energy management that were enabled. The 2018 version enables basically all forms of EV energy management. In BC, that's expected to be adopted into the BC Electrical Code in early 2019, and I would suspect it's a similar sort of schedule for most other provinces across the country, but this is now enabled in the Canada Electric Code. I just also note that for single-family homes, duplex, parking where you've got your own private garage, typically providing an energized outlet will be quite a modest cost. So maybe around $200 in the context of the cost for a whole single-family home. It can vary a little bit. Now, sometimes the additional incremental load that you get by adding a 40 amp circuit could exceed the capacity of, let's say, a 200 amp panel, and that's what would kick you into a panel upgrade and greater service from the utility. So that can be quite expensive if you're paying for a larger panel. There are EV energy management solutions, though, that can address this type of building as well. So these are two products from Canadian manufacturers that basically will measure the amount of power that's being delivered to the building and allocate the remaining capacity to the EV so it can be charged and you can avoid doing that panel upgrade. So these technologies are more costly than just running a circuit, which we're saying would very roughly be about $200, more in the $700 to $1,000 range, but they're less costly than doing your electrical panel upgrade. So understanding those costs, and after quite extensive engagement with our development community and home building community, as well as BC Hydro, EV charging service providers, and a public engagement, we brought forward recommendations to City Council to amend the parking and loading section of the zoning bylaw. So technically this is a parking design requirement as part of our parking regulations. And it requires that all residential parking, excluding visitor parking, feature an energized outlet capable of providing level 2 charging or higher. The or higher is just to anticipate some types of charging solutions that are being considered by BC Hydro and others as pilots, where you'd actually provide, let's say, a 600-volt delivery right off of their main service into parkades and bypass the building's transformer. So we want it to be sort of future-proofing the requirement. That's the reason there's the or higher. Outlets have to be labeled for EV charging, so it's kind of a nudge to the homeowner who's ever parking in that spot in a shared parking space that there is a supply of energy for EV charging. And for designs that use EV energy management, which we expect to be a lot of them, the directive engineering can set a performance standard. So what do I mean by an energized outlet? Basically, that's a junction box or an electric receptacle. So the EV service equipment, the charging station, developers are certainly welcome to implement that. We'd love to see that, but that isn't required. So since adopting this requirement in December of last year, so about a year ago, we have seen a lot of activity from other jurisdictions in the region moving towards the same thing. So Vancouver adopted what is essentially the same requirement in April of 2018. And since that time, you can see that there's been, I guess, 6 other jurisdictions that have adopted the same thing or something quite similar, sometimes also making provisions for commercial parking and not just residential. And it's under consideration in a number of other jurisdictions. I suspect within the next 6 months, most, if not all, of these under considerations will also be gold stars and will have adopted the same requirement. To support implementation, Richmond has developed a number of resources, both for other local governments and for developers, electrical designers, other interested parties. So I noted the costing study that we did a year and a half ago. This fall, we also published 2 documents in partnership with BC Hydro that provide more information, firstly through this guide for local governments to other local governments considering similar sorts of requirements. So this is written for a BC audience, but there's a lot of information in there that would be useful to other jurisdictions considering similar sorts of requirements. It provides an overview of why residential EV charging is important and considerations for when a local government is developing their own EV charging requirements, what they should be thinking about in developing that, what are good practices. Also some information on thinking about how to support EV charging in existing residential buildings. And then the second document we co-published with BC Hydro was this work, EV charging infrastructure and shared parking areas, resources to support implementation and charging infrastructure requirements. So this is predominantly focused for developers, electrical designers, property managers, local governments that want to have a rich understanding of what are the technologies that can be used to enable EV charging in shared multifamily parking areas or other types of shared parking, workplace, for example. And what it does is lays out the different types of EV energy management systems that are out there, categorizes those, provides electrical schematics to show how you would design electrical systems to support different types of EV energy management, and then actually compares the different vendors of EV charging stations and EV energy management systems to what types of management systems they're compatible with. It also provides guidance for what sorts of content should be in condominium bylaws and rules to govern effectively the use of EV charging infrastructure. So laying out how do you reconcile the building owner or the condominiums paying for the electricity, and how can the drivers then recompense them for the use of that electricity? How do you ensure that through your rules that the right types of EV charging stations will be implemented, and other sorts of issues like that that are important to, again, bake into condominium rules so that they're going to be using this infrastructure effectively. And we can provide that for developers to put into their rules and bylaws to hand off to stratas. So just to provide a small sample of what information is in the local government guide, there's this framework for evaluating different types of EV readiness requirements. So different jurisdictions that have looked into doing this have made different definitions of what constitutes EV readiness. So you can see Richmond required all parking stalls, and other jurisdictions in the Lower Mainland, all parking stalls be energized. Some have required that only a percentage be energized. Some have defined sort of a partial completion of the circuit. So you're not fully completing the circuit like you would with an energized stall, but there could be less or more degrees of, I'm getting a ringing. Hopefully that doesn't return. degrees of the level of completion of the circuits. And lastly, some jurisdictions have actually said new developments must install the EV service equipment, the charging stations. So it provides these different evaluation criteria, minimizing upfront cost, minimizing later retrofit costs to the end user. Is it going to be simple for the condominium association to administer? How simple will it be for the city to do their compliance systems and ensure that the requirement is actually being followed? Is it equitable for all residents based on if they're going to be getting an EV in the short term versus at some point in the future? And is it future-proof for different types of EV charging technology, such as inductive, underfloor charging that might come into the future, and sort of grades these different ways of defining EV readiness. And so it's kind of a framework to help document that for a number of reasons, moving towards 100% or a large percentage of energized stalls is going to be more effective than these other ways of defining readiness. So in thinking about how we developed these requirements and what other jurisdictions would do, this is sort of a schematic of the process that we went through. So firstly, reviewing enabling legislation, making sure that our legal departments are comfortable that we can proceed in this regard, understanding what technologies and EV charging services are available to provide charging in different contexts. So single family homes versus MURBs, what are the different ways to do EV energy management, those different governance issues that I mentioned. Considering different ways to define EV readiness and understanding the costs of those different strategies. So we've conducted, as I mentioned, Richmond's costing study. There has been some previous work from City of Vancouver, also recent work from City of North Vancouver, and I understand Township of Langley. There's other work that's happened in other jurisdictions across North America, all of which can help local governments across Canada understand what are going to be the cost implications of different sorts of EV-ready requirements. And then most importantly, rigorous sort of stakeholder engagement programs. So both internally with city staff, our law departments, transportation, planning and development applications, buildings, so we understand what are going to be the roles in enforcing this and have agreement on what the requirements would entail. Definitely public engagement, and then certainly working with developers and with the home building community so that they understand the requirements, the rationale for why to go in a certain direction, and understand how to do this cost effectively. They're typically among the certainly development and even the electrical design community isn't a really good understanding at the outset that EV energy management technologies exist. So sometimes they can assume costs are greater than they actually would be. And then also communicating with EV charging service providers so you can understand their business models and how they'll serve, especially multifamily buildings. And that can lead to proposing requirements for council's consideration. So the proposed services we would offer as part of this project kind of mirror that framework. Firstly, reviewing enabling legislation in different provinces to see what might be avenues to develop similar sorts of parking or zoning requirements. So I'm not a lawyer, I can't provide legal advice, but I can review what legislation might be enabling that can then inform your conversations with your own legal counsel. We would provide a series of 3 webinars to get into more depth on a number of the issues I just spoke about. So building the rationale for why I develop these sorts of requirements and looking at different practices from across different jurisdictions. A session on understanding the technologies, service models, and associated costs with different types of EV energy management. We might involve some of the EV charging service providers to explain their services as part of that. And then going through some of those multifamily building governance issues I mentioned. All this material would be summarized in sort of an issue brief that would have a sort of pan-Canadian audience in mind. So it would complement those resources that have been developed by City of Richmond that are more specific to British Columbia with kind of more general, applicable across all jurisdictions content. We'd also be looking to support your engagement processes in implementing these sorts of requirements. So developing model engagement materials, PowerPoints, potentially other sorts of material that could serve when working with developers, home builders, the public, internal staff. And then we would have one process to engage with EV charging service companies on behalf of all CUSP members so that they're not all receiving inquiries from multiple different local governments and can have a more considered response to one inquiry around the extent to which they're able to serve different markets across the country currently. And finally, providing that model language for requirements likely based off of what's been developed in the Lower Mainland. So that's a more sort of intensive scope of services for developing requirements for new buildings. We would also be looking to, at something of a higher level, support other aspects of what would constitute local government's EV strategies and action plans. So we know there's a lot of effort going into developing these in jurisdictions across North America right now. And the idea would be to, amongst this group, share what are best practices and really priority actions to bake into work plans going forward across a range of issue areas. So we would be focusing on sort of 6 issue areas. The first, just around general rationale for why develop an EV strategy, what benefits will that confer to your community, and then how is it going to be best to manage the implementation of that strategy and the development of it going forward. So what kinds of governance working across different departments within municipal governments, as well as potentially reaching out to external partners, can play a role in the ongoing governance and implementation of the strategy. And then the next 5 bullets speaking to the individual content that would be part of these strategies. So I just spoke to charging infrastructure requirements for new buildings. This would initially focus on supporting at home, but also flag as part of strategies that there's an opportunity to consider requirements that can support a source of electricity for at work charging, as well as public charging within new developments. Thinking about what are roles that local governments can play to support implementation and retrofit of EV charging stations into existing buildings. So what is key policy considerations at the provincial as well as local level that we can advocate for or implement, and look at some best practices and voluntary programs that can enable this sort of charging to take place. Think about leadership in city fleets. So EV first policies that prioritize EVs if there's electrical models that meet the duty cycle required for that type of application. There's been a number of municipalities that have implemented these sorts of policies and wound up seeing that for certain types of vehicles and a growing type of vehicles, then the priority switches to all electric moving forward. What needs to be considered in planning for EV charging at city facilities, and thinking about bulk procurement or other types of strategic procurement initiatives. Next big bucket of focus would be city-owned, publicly accessible EV charging networks. So how can cities serve as site hosts, and what are best practices for managing our own EV charging networks? And lastly, thinking about driving consumer demand through what are best practices around education campaigns, what sorts of parking incentives can be offered to provide additional perks for EV adoption. A number of local governments have had success, sometimes in concert with their fleet initiatives involving the public in bulk purchase programs and other sorts of initiatives. So we would explore this and flag best practices for your consideration that could be, again, written into EV action plans. There'd be briefing papers that would outline what are some of those priority actions and important context and precedents to consider across each of those different areas I just noted. We'd also have webinars on each of them to complement those papers. And for some of those areas, model procurement languages. So for instance, for fleet electrification initiatives or public EV charging, instead of necessitating rewriting procurement documents to get partners to help deliver those services, trying to source what are some of the best structured procurement documents that have already been created and share that with this group. So thanks very much. Really looking forward to having a discussion about if these types of services suit your needs and your work plans over the coming year. I will note the idea would be to have all this delivered by the end of March. So it would be sort of on a shorter term, really focusing on helping to, again, identify what are those best practices that we can help different Canadian cities implement. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Brendan. So we've got about 20 minutes to do questions from folks on the line. And just to, again, provide the context, I mean, this is a lot of work for Brendan to help deliver in the first quarter of 2019. In part, that's because everybody seems to be well on their way to developing these, and we don't want to miss the opportunity to share some of these best practices and create more of an exchange of knowledge between cities. But also it's because there's some federal funding that's going to be made available probably in the next week or so, provided that you can deliver the project by the end of their fiscal year.